afternoon, everybody. Vijay Prashad. Let me start by welcoming Vijay Prashad to Egypt, to Cairo, to the English department, Cairo University. We took a short tour and we made it clear to him that generally this is not the Cairo University design. We both having a quarter of a million students at any given time. So it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you all for being with us. Vijay is from India. He teaches and is or was chair of South Asian history at Trinity College. Is? Was. Was. All right. Because now, so he teaches in Connecticut, in the USA, but now he's the advertising chair at the American University. So he has done the work. He is sitting, and I am standing here, where Edward Said stood many times along the Lake, and it sort of is no coincidence that he is the chair of the Edward Said, is the Edward Said chair at the university. Now, quite specific, Prashad published more than a dozen books, and is not only interested in politics, history, and culture, but in literature, sports, and humor. Now, while we are busy here discussing the history program of writing the history of Egypt, he is busy working on, and will be talking to us today about writing the history of the global south. Knowing that you are probably more interested in hearing him speak rather than me speak about him, I ask you to join me in welcoming Vijay Prashad. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project of writing. I thought that might be something that if you wouldn't mind, I would love to. I will love myself actually. It's actually a repeat gift because Maha came to Beirut and gave us the itinerary of her career as a way to talk about American studies in Egypt. So I thought I'd return the favor and give you my itinerary and talk a little bit about a journey that I have taken and still in the middle of taking. So,
Vijay,
yeah.
Is this book going to be ours?
If you like, but not immediately, because I'm leaving tomorrow.
Okay, so we can lend this to you today.
Yes.
And
Fair enough.
see, because we have a few faculty members.
Fair enough, please.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm asking your permission. I should have done that earlier. We're videotaping this.
I see.
Would you like to do
Yeah.
it? Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
So I thought I'd give you a sense of a journey and a sense of what I've been up to, if you don't know. So I'll start by saying that I came of political age in a terrible time in India. It was between the 1975 emergency law, when the constitution was taken away, and we had 2 years of what is called in India the emergency period. And that was on one side, between 1975 and 77. The other side, 1984, was when in the city of Delhi there was a major riot after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India. And in that riot, in 2 days, 3,000 people were killed. And the people that were killed were targeted, they were Sikhs. So it was what in India we call a communal riot. And you cannot imagine the feeling in a major city like Delhi to see something like this happen. In other words, I'm going to say a terrible thing, which is that I grew up with the belief that when things like this happen, they happen in rural areas. And they couldn't happen in cities, because cities were civilized. And cities were not places where people went after each other on grounds of religion. Simply couldn't happen. Of course it did happen, and it was naive to believe that it couldn't happen because it had already happened before. One of the earliest riots to take place in India in 1961 was in a major industrial place. In Delhi, in 1947-48, there had been terrible religious war in 2 years during the partition of India. So it was a naive belief, but you know, there's no reason for naive beliefs not to be real. And so in other words, this was a terrible period because up to the 1975 point, India had taken strides of a very hopeful, in a very hopeful direction. By which I don't mean that, the government had been benevolent to the people or anything, but they were developing major struggles inside India to transform the compact between the government and the people. And that struggle had started in 1971-72 when there was a major railway strike. Now, I'm a great fan of trains, and I think trains are not only the past but the future. And airplanes are terrible and cars are stupid. And trains should be how we organize, countries and cities. I mean, if there was nice trains all over, people could travel and meet each other and barriers would break and they wouldn't have to be privatized in their cars. They could be in a compartment and they could look at each other and say, oh, you look like that. You're reading, I'm reading, maybe I can ask you what are you reading. Now again, this is a highly optimistic view because in many places in the world there are trains where people don't look at each other or talk to each other, but still, the potential exists. You'll find in the half an hour that I speak, I say a lot of overly optimistic things. So just keep that in mind. These movements had developed and they were quite powerful. And then in a blink, the movements were killed off. And so I remember going to study in undergraduate and then do my graduate training. And I remember walking into colleges where the teachers were deeply cynical. And they seemed exhausted by the pressures of the world. And they had the view that, the world, that is the South, India, had failed and exhausted itself. And the state was a disaster. And something else was needed. And the entire experiment after independence had been basically a big failure. That was the view. Now, at some level I sympathized with that because I also felt, and as I got older, I felt it a little more. That is true. We are backward people. How much we deny. There is a kind of a sense of backwardness that needed to be confronted. The question is, how do you understand that backwardness and how do you confront it? And what does backwardness mean? So it's very interesting because I've been working with the family of Gandhi Hassan Hudan, the great Lebanese Marxist, and one of his first pieces of writing when he returned to Lebanon, he was an interesting man. He went to Lyon in France in 1958 with a PhD on Althusser. Then he moved to Algeria, where he lived in Constantine, and he taught Fanon. Fanon had died in 1961, but Mariano taught Fanon in night classes and wrote his first article on Fanon in an Algerian journal. But then when he moves to Lebanon, he wrote a very interesting article in the communist newspaper called Tariq, which was called Colonialism and Backwardness. And he said this must have been in 68, somewhere around 68, 69, he said we need to confront backwardness. But again, just as I said, not in the way one might expect, but in another way. We cannot hide from the fact of backwardness. So, the old understanding of backwardness is rooted in colonial thinking. And the very most mature version was there in the idea that the world is backward because it has the wrong religion. And the king of this thinking, of course, was Max Weber, who, when he wrote his, very stimulating essay on capitalism and the Protestant ethic, Weber argued that capitalism required Protestantism. Protestantism was the culture of capitalism, because Protestantism was about saving. And other God-forsaken religions don't save, so they can't be capitalists. In other words, they are fated to being secondary. Of course, if you read this, why I say it's a stimulating essay is because it's beautifully written and beautifully argued, but we all know that Europe didn't emerge as a capitalist continent because they saved. I mean, it emerges as a capitalist continent because they stole. I mean, they stole the silver from the mines of Potosi in South America. They stole the labor of humans through human slavery. They stole by, filching 1/3 of the land revenue from Bengal. You may not know this, but in 1770, 13 years after the British took Bengal, 1/3 of the population died in the famine. I mean, someday somebody will write the big book of colonial horrors. That book has not been written yet. The real horrors, where genocide of the proportions of 1/3 of the population wiped out in 1 year. That's a catastrophe. Or in the Belgians in Africa, where they killed 10 million people in 8 years in the Central African region, when they were forcibly mining rubber, through trees. The brutality is just unbelievable. So we know Weber was all nonsense, in his theory. It's a beautiful book. I recommend people read The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It's a beautiful essay, but it's totally wrong-headed. It's there you say to somebody like Max Weber, you need to learn your history and economics. You can't, it's insufficient to write this kind of account knowing religious studies and philosophy and the kind of sociology that he was working out with. Anyway, Weber then inaugurates a tradition of studying other religions. Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Islam. And in his episodic writings, he declares they are all insufficient. As I said. Entire schools developed out of this. There was a man called Milton Singer, a very distinguished scholar of India, who wrote a book called When a Great Tradition Modernizes. And he went and studied business people in South India in the period of the 50s. And what Singer found was that these business people in South India who are not Protestants are good businessmen, but they cannot become proper capitalists. Now, so this, I'm just trying to suggest to you, is the language that continues through the 50s, and I would hazard there is some of that even today, where there's a sense that these places simply can't get together because they don't have the Protestant ethic, the Northern European ethic of saving, of dealing with each other, of respecting labor and freeing labor truly, things like that. Anyway, when the world, or when colonialism became secular, which is maybe in the 1920s and 30s, in this era after the Ottoman Empire, that's when you start seeing evangelical writing take the backseat and more scientific secular writing emerge to tell us that we are backward. There you get a kind of precursor to modernization theory. And so instead of saying that you have the wrong religion, now the language is you simply are too tied to your communities. In modernization theory, the argument was you move from tradition or Gemeinschaft, which is a tight-knit community, you move to modernity, which is where you have contracts and you have civil society, Gesellschaft. So the journey from community to civil society is the journey into the modern world. So you get scholars all around the world saying the problem with these places, Egypt of course being one of them, is that they are too tied to their communities. Not to religion now, but to community. And unless they break with community and become individuals, you cannot have modernity. So, you may not, nobody reads this stuff anymore, but it's deeply influential. Leonard Binder, for instance, ran a big study which was on social change in the Muslim world in the 1950s and 60s, where they looked at, starting from Morocco, which was 6 different countries, Morocco, Egypt, Pakistan, Indonesia, and points in between. Maybe Iran was one more. Anyway, they wanted to study, what's wrong with people here? Why aren't they becoming individuals? And I'm sure you've heard this occasionally, this kind of thing in your personal lives, where somebody will say, you shouldn't worry so much about your family, your career is more important to you, or things to that effect. That sentence actually has distinguished philosophical roots. In Hegel, for instance, who in the philosophy of the state says that you move from family to civil society to the state. The state is the most rational, the family is the least rational. So the more a cultural world is trapped by family, the less advanced it is. So when we secularize backwardness, we come to the place where we're told problem in these societies is no more just religion, mere religion. It's now there's too much community. And this is a very bizarre argument because later in the West there will be a valorization of community, where people will say community is important. We need community gardens, we need community, occupy. What's great about it is people came together and formed communities. At the other end, it's okay now to valorize community since you've gone through individuality. So I guess the journey is a dialectical journey, community, individual, and then a kind of higher form of community. So that may be how they justify it. Anyway, so just to tie those two things together, the journey and then these theories, around the time of the 1980s, when post-colonial studies starts to emerge, critical studies start to emerge, when studies start to emerge saying imperial thinking needs to be contested and challenged in such light. Often what happened was, to my mind, he didn't actually seriously ask what is the reason of backwardness. It often took these kind of things, this kind of religious critique from Weber or this kind of modernization theory, and attacked it on its face. So it became a theoretical rebuttal of a theory, and it argued directly against it. And there are, and I'll say a few more things about it in a minute, but there are cognates that's related to a very important development in cultural studies. And I'll say this first, and it might explain the former one, it might be more explanatory. So, in cultural studies, in the 1980s and 90s, when it looked at the world, development began. Because until the 1980s, the general argument was that, when fast food comes to Egypt or to India or to Hong Kong or wherever, when culture is globalized, it actually is being Americanized. So the world is becoming American. So for instance, everywhere you go, there are fast food restaurants, and this is either for some people a good thing and for others a bad thing. But the explanation was that this is American culture being exported to the world. And then in cultural studies in the 1980s, a critique came saying, no, this is too simple, it's too simple-minded. What actually happens is when Kentucky Fried Chicken or when McDonald's comes to India, it comes in its own way. And Indians have agency, and they shape it in such a way that it's no longer just American. So, for instance, superficially, you can't serve beef there, so they serve lamb burgers. And there is tandoori pizza in Pizza Hut. And it was a kind of superficial, attempt to say, to my mind, to say that this is not Americanism, it's actually, there is a hybrid form developed. So in cultural studies, that was what was going on. In post-coloniality, actually, there is a similar kind of language of hybridity emerges. That Weber was wrong in assuming that Christianity was in the West and Islam is in the East or whatever. What you actually have is a form of hybridity that developed. So the critique of backwardness was that their landscape was wrong, of advanced and backward. In fact, instead of saying we need to critique their way of thinking, it was that we need to critique the landscape they create of backward and advanced. In fact, things are more complicated. So even Edward Said would come toward the end of his career to the point of contrapuntal readings. Or for instance, a new humanism, secular humanism. We have to start seeing things in a more complicated way. I don't actually think this is sufficient, which is what I'm going to develop in a minute. That's why I started by saying we have to confront our own backwardness. It's not enough to say, no, we're not backward. You're reading us wrong. Okay? So that's why I began with it. I'll come to that in a minute. So what I'm suggesting is that, ironically, mainstream post-colonial studies, mainstream cultural studies was along the grain of the globalization of capitalism. In other words, just as McDonald's is going to show up in India and say, well, we're not really McDonald's. We're McDonald's India. We're not really Kentucky Fried Chicken, we're Kentucky Fried Chicken Cairo. It's a whole different game. We're listening to you, customers, and you are helping us design the menu. I remember reading a book about Hong Kong, which was a very insightful book. One of the most insightful things about this book about McDonald's in Hong Kong was how the anthropologists discovered that McDonald's in Hong Kong raised the standard of cleanliness in bathrooms in Hong Kong restaurants. Okay. I mean, that's an interesting thing. That's interesting maybe hotel management. You know, that's an insight, interesting, but it doesn't really tell you anything about the sensibility when somebody says, I would rather eat in McDonald's than go to a stand and eat, congee. There's something else happening there which is not being there.